Moses was the first man to lead the children of Israel as God's chosen people, as a unified nation. And his strength and his patience, his wonderful leadership, which he exemplified, really set the gold standard for many years. And later on, Jesus was actually compared to him. In Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, therefore, holy brothers, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Jesus, who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in all his house. And he was able, Moses, was able to lead the people out of captivity, of course, not through his own power, but through God's. He was able to lead the people out of captivity, out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, and after they sinned, he led them all the way around in circles through the wilderness. He brought them toward the promised land. Now, needing a wise and just successor, Moses chose a man named Joshua to replace him. And of course, Joshua was his general. He was the commander of the armies, and he led them, all through the time that they wandered around in figure eights and circles through the Sinai Peninsula, through the wilderness. And now he was going to lead them across the Jordan and into the promised land. And by his leadership, God was able to bring the people into the land which he had promised to them, to their forefathers, to Abraham. And they were able to begin the process of removing the natives from the land and claiming this territory. But then Joshua died, and things began to unravel very quickly after that. It really doesn't take long. We read in the book of Joshua all these stories of heroism and bravery, of boldness and service to God. And then we come to the book of Judges immediately after. And we find this selection of disgusting and sordid tales. Society dismantling to the point where it's practically anarchy and everything's really just falling apart. Now, what I want to do this evening, very quickly, is take a look at the book of Judges, at what happened after the death of Joshua, why it was that things fell apart so quickly. What was it that really happened, and why they fell to this point? If you're not there, turn to Judges chapter 1, and I want you to look with me and consider the opening verses of this book. Judges chapter 1. And it picks up right where we would expect it to after reading through Joshua. It says, "Now it happened after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel asked of the Lord, saying, Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" Now, there were times in the book of Joshua when they should have inquired of the Lord, and they failed to do so. Famously, the instance with the Gibeonites, when the Gibeonites came to them and claimed to be from a far-off land and asked to broker a covenant with them. And when the Israelites didn't inquire of the Lord, they ended up making a pact with some of the locals. And so when we see them here asking of the Lord, we might be inclined to be a little bit excited about this. Wow, I can't believe they're actually doing this. They never do that. They're asking of the Lord. And it's true. They could be asking out of their deep desire to follow God and in service to Him. But I suspect it was more from a communal heart of cowardice. Look at what it is that they ask. They ask who it is that is going to go up. God had promised Joshua and the people along with him, Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. "Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be in dread or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." God has promised multiple times that as long as they are faithful to him, he will fight their battles. They don't have to worry about who's taking the charge, who's taking the lead, who's going where. As long as they're serving him and doing what he says, he will fight their battles and they'll win them. Yet here it seems their fear overtook them. When God informed Isaiah that he needed a messenger, Isaiah actually begs God, and he says, "Here am I, send me, pick me." But the Israelites instead say, "Here are we, send anyone but me." Who are you going to send, Lord? Who's going to go first? Well, whatever the reasoning is behind their asking, God selects the tribe of Judah. Verse 2, the Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And yet, even after God chooses them, the Judahites implore the tribe of Simeon for help. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I, in turn, will go with you into the territory allotted you." And so Simeon went with him. Now, the first problem that the Israelites face, the first thing that leads them away from God, is simply that they stopped trusting in God. They should be trusting in God to fight their battles. They have every reason to believe that. They've gone through all these fights with Joshua at their head. They've defeated these major cities. And all they're doing at this point, at least all they're supposed to be doing at this point, is just clearing out the rest. And yet this fear sets in. Was it because their trust to begin with was more in Joshua than it was in God? I don't know. But Judah here apparently feels inadequate. They don't feel that they can go into this land themselves, and so they solicit aid from the tribe of Simeon. Now, as a result of this, Simeon's territory is never going to be fully independent of Judah. In fact, if you look on a map of where the 12 tribes end up, Simeon's territory is in the middle. It is within Judah's territory. And they go into the land and they fight together, and so they end up overlapping their land. Which, as a side note, is kind of interesting when we think of later on down the road when the 12 tribes split. We usually think of the 2 and the 10, but in reality, Simeon would have been in the south as well, so it was probably closer to 3 and 9, but rounding, right? But anyway, I want for us to ask ourselves what kind of people we are. Are we the kind of people that have to be begged, have to be personally solicited to work in God's kingdom, or are we the kind of people that are going to volunteer ourselves? And I hope that we would be the kind of people who would trust in the promise of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 through 20, Jesus said, "Go therefore, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to keep all that I commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Jesus promises that when we go out and we fulfill his commands, that we act as his soldiers, he is going to fight our battle. He will be with us. It's not that everyone we approach is going to obey the gospel and that our lives are just going to be flowers, sunshine, and rainbows. But he does promise that he will be with us. And I do think of the hymn and the words, "There is much to do, there is work on every hand. Hark, the cry for help comes ringing through the land. Jesus calls for reapers, I must active be. What wilt thou, O Master? Here am I, send me." And yet the Israelites are not that kind of people. They are the kind of people who want someone else to do their work. Following this, we continue through the chapter. We skip down a little bit, and we discover that the Judahites do go on to conquer much land. And we see highlighted for us great men like Othniel and Caleb, who are good, godly, righteous men. But then after that, as we come down toward verse 19, we find a sad list of places that remained unconquered. And almost all of the tribes, I think I counted 8 out of the 12, left patches of Canaanites and Amorites in the land. In verse 19, we find that Judah left Canaanites and Philistines in the valley. In verse 21, Benjamin left the Jebusites, the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. Verses 27 and 28, Manasseh left the Canaanites in Megiddo, and those were particularly the worshippers of Molech. Verses 29 and 30, Ephraim and Zebulun left swaths of Canaanites in their territories. 31 and 32, Asher left the Canaanites and Phoenicians along the coast. Later on, they're going to produce for us Jezebel and her wonderful family. In verse 33, Naphtali left Canaanites. And if you look at the names of the cities there in verse 33, Beth Shemesh, Beth Anath, these cities were probably cities with major pagan temples in them. So these weren't even just regular cities. They were heavily populated with Canaanite worship. And then in 34 through 36, the tribe of Dan, who's one of the worst tribes, as we see in the book of Judges, left the wicked Amorites in their territory. Now these numerous failures here right at the beginning, right early on in Israel's history, are going to produce much more complicated failures and problems later in this book and later on in their history. They're going to live with these decisions for the rest of their existence. They're never really going to live this down. Much of the reason that this book exists, that God has to send these judges or deliverers to free them, is because these people, the Canaanites, the Philistines, and the Amorites, the Phoenicians, kept oppressing the Israelites and taking hold of them. Now, there were some other groups of people, like the Moabites, the Mesopotamians, and others, who they were not responsible for conquering. But as you approach the end of the book, their largest oppressor becomes the Philistines, who were the responsibility of the tribe of Judah. So what is the problem here? The problem is that they did not trust God. They did not trust God to continue the work that Joshua started. They did not trust God to finish this work either. And as a result, they are going to deal with these consequences. And if we want to avoid this kind of a problem, if we want to finish what it is that we've started, we must keep the same trust in God now that we exhibited when we first became Christians. We have to continue to work hard, continue to work to the end until our work is complete. Everything starts and everything ends with a trust in God. Now, as you come into chapter 3, verses 6 and 7. They stop trusting God, and then they stop fearing God. Judges 3, 6, and 7. They took their daughters for themselves as wives, and gave their own daughters to their sons, and served their gods. It's talking about the relationship of the children of Israel with the children of the Canaanites and the other local peoples. Thus the sons of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Now, you have to keep this in mind in the historical context. And I say this because as you read through the book of Judges, it can be a little bit confusing whether they want to worship God or not. And it's because the ancient Near Eastern peoples, the people in ancient Israel, Syria, Mesopotamia, they believed that you could just stack gods. Okay? You know, we are deeply ingrained in a monotheistic society. We're used to that. But for them, monotheism was a revolutionary concept. There weren't a whole lot of people who only worshiped one God. And so they had their national deity, or at least that was the way they saw it. They had their national deity, Yahweh. But then there were also local deities who were responsible for, the valleys, for example, or gods who were responsible for the rain. And so you'd kind of assemble your own collection of gods, and you'd worship all of them. And so the point here is not necessarily that they had completely abandoned God, but that they had abandoned or rejected God's jealousy and his uniqueness. And to use a bit of a crude expression, God had become their religious side piece. Now, many years later, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea are going to fully employ the language of spiritual adultery to describe what they're doing. That on the one hand, they want to be married to God, that they want to have that relationship, but they also want to have these other relationships with other gods. And God describes himself as having taken Israel to be his bride, that he had blessed her, and he had protected her and taken care of her. And rather than being faithful to him, she chose to seek out pleasure from other deities, leaving God as a side piece. And love and faithfulness toward him became secondary. And God describes it with this language. And in Ezekiel, he uses much more graphic language than I'm going to use. But eventually it does get to the point where they don't even worship God on the side. He's not even just an extra God to them. They eventually abandon him totally as we get further into the book. And they stop obeying God. This is the third level. Now, you might think that this means that they dedicated themselves to serving Baal or serving Molech or one of the other local gods. But the book of Judges uses a different kind of expression. In Judges 21, verse 25, once you reach the final words of this book, it sums up the status of the children of Israel and says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I was talking to Craig just this morning about an illustration I heard a long time ago. I love this illustration so much. Some of you know I just got a pet cat, which she's a very sweet little thing. She likes to climb up on my shoulder. But the thing that I understand about my cat, and about all cats in general, is that a cat will never obey you. There's no such thing. You cannot ever get your cat to obey you. Your cat will do what it wants, and sometimes it happens to agree with you. Now, the difference is you could have a pet dog, and you can get a dog to get to the point where it will obey you, and it will deny itself and obey you instead. You can't get a cat to that point. Now, that is, unfortunately, sometimes how we are, in that we sometimes obey God when we like to, and when we agree with him. And we're just very fortunate if we happen to agree with him very often. And we might easily mistake that for serving him. Now, the Israelites might have been mistaken. You're not going to mistake them for serving God. You're not going to get confused and think that. But you might think that they're serving these other gods. That's not the case. Instead, they've become their own gods. And they do what they want to do. And whenever it happens to line up with what Baal says, or what Yahweh says, or any other god that might be around for them to agree with, then they'll do what they want to do. Service to their own desires was chief. Nothing else seems to matter. And the book of Judges ends with this series of horrific tales of sin and depravity, wickedness, and they had fallen so far from being the people that Joshua had originally led into victory. You read these last 3 or 4 chapters and you think, there's no way these are the same people that God saved, that God did all these wonders. There's no way these are the same people who saw the works of God in producing the manna and the quail. And the truth is that they're not the same people. They're a new generation which has risen, which does not trust God, which does not fear God, and now does not obey God, even in pretense. God was entirely absent from their thoughts. And it's sad because the progression began all the way at the very beginning. They went from not trusting God to not fearing Him, and from there to not obeying. And it's this exact progression that we have to avoid. We often try to treat the symptom. The symptom is disobedience. Disobedience is not really the root problem. Yes, we need to fix the sin in our lives, but the sin itself, the actions, the behaviors, that's not the root problem. And you're not going to root sin out of your life if you start with the actions. That's a superficial obedience. That's a superficial submission to God. Instead, you have to start at the root. You have to dig all the way down and learn to trust in God. There's a reason why in Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, that he talks about how worrying is a problem and worrying is a sin. It's not because worrying in itself is some egregious affront to morality. It's because when we worry and we fail to trust in God to provide for us, we sow the seeds that will later bear the fruit of disobedience and wickedness. It begins in our hearts. And the attitude and the relationship that we have with God at a fundamental level. Now, of course, if our trust and our fear in God don't ultimately manifest in obedience, then it's not real faith. Hebrews chapter 5 verse 9 says, having been made perfect, Jesus became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. This eternal salvation is only available to those who obey. If you don't obey, you're not going to receive eternal life. It is that simple. But it does begin with our faith, with our trust in God, in the promises which he has made, and his love for us. And that when God says that he cares for us, and he says that he will fight our battles for us, and he says that we do not need to worry about the things of this life, but we can focus instead on eternity, faith means that we believe that and we trust in that, and our mindset each day begins to shift. Israel fell because they stopped obeying God, but really they fell because they stopped trusting in God. They never really believed that he was going to fight their battles, and one domino toppled the next. So I give you this short history lesson to remind you. Throughout your week, keep your trust in God. Keep your focus on his promises, on his love, on his goodness. And I pray that he will strengthen you throughout the days to come, and you will serve him faithfully. If you have any need, please come while we stand and sing.